It's great to be here again. I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you about ClientScript. We got some slides too that I'll pull up here in a minute. But first, just wanted to kind of talk about the direction I want to go today. This is not an exhaustive treatment of everything possible in ClientScript. That would be, way more than we have time for. And there are also already some great resources out there. I know we've mentioned a few already here of sort of training type videos and things like that. And so not wanting to just replicate what's already been done there. I want to share some things that I've learned, and especially some experimentation on some of the newer features that maybe not everyone has seen yet. And I also want to have time at the end for others here to share tips you may have. I mean, I know a fair number of us have probably been working in ClientScript. I'm sure some of you are stronger than me, even potentially, in some of the aspects of ClientScript. And I want to make sure we have time at the end just for sharing of questions, but also of tips from the group. So yeah, let me pull up my slides and we'll dive into it. But that's where we're headed today. This is, I think, as much of a conversation as it is a presentation. Let me share my slides. So yes, I am Christopher Mowers. I am Zoho Team Lead and developer at AspenTech CRM. We're a Zoho partner based in Novi, Michigan, USA. Oh, sorry. Got a double. All right, so I know most of you here probably are familiar with ClientScript, but just in case this is new for you, ClientScript in the CRM is code execution that happens as a part of the presentation of CRM, meaning that it's not happening sort of on the back end. It's not happening as your page refreshes or things like that. It's actually happening as a part of the user interface. And so it allows for the custom extension of the user interface to achieve specific use cases. For those of us that have been developing in Zoho for a while, the pattern you're most familiar with is, someone makes a change, the record saves, and then some automation kicks off and does whatever. And that's a big part of it even today, of course. But ClientScript allows for more immediate action to be taken, and that could be to do custom modifications to the user interface, or it could be to just take more immediate action. So use cases like data validation, making sure that an email is a certain way before the record is saved, or making sure that an address is valid before the record is saved, or when you set up a lookup and you've got on a child record some related fields that you want to come over, like maybe address details, having that come over before the record is saved, not waiting for the save, right? And other types of pre-processing. As far as technology goes, ClientScript is JavaScript, and it runs in the web browser, which is important as you look at how to really work through and test this. Understanding that the execution is happening in the browser of the client, the user, and not happening on some back-end server. Challenges for a Zoho developer here. First of all, the use of JavaScript. Now, no doubt some of you are very familiar with JavaScript and are totally comfortable there. Great if you are. But I know a lot of folks come at this from, Deluge maybe as their first language, and understanding the paradigms and conventions of JavaScript can be a challenge. It's an incredibly flexible language. There are typically no single right ways to do things in that language. And that makes it really hard to grab onto sometimes, because you can look at 18 different ways to do the same thing. And that can be, I know, hard and frustrating. But I will tell you that the ClientScript we typically write in CRM is usually very simple, and it's something you can grasp without having to really go deep into JavaScript necessarily. Maintainability is a big challenge, and we're going to talk about some of my approaches, and I would love to know other approaches when we get to the end. I mean, it's just, the way that it's set up in the CRM is really poses some challenges for code maintainability. And then also performance is something to consider, where where you have, in the case of like a Deluge function attached to a workflow, you can be relatively confident that, oh, this will only run under this condition. With something like client script, depending on your trigger, it could run a lot and be very hard to predict because it's going to happen as users interact with the user interface. And there aren't sort of as many initial filters like there would be on something like a workflow. So it's just something to consider, and especially if the script is a little bit overly intense in terms of what it does, then it's going to slow down the UI and directly affect the user experience in a way that a behind the scenes Deluge function wouldn't necessarily have the same impact. Likewise, if you're plugging into the Zoho CRM API in your client script directly, then you have to consider that aspect too, right? That you could potentially run through API credits at a much faster rate than something like a workflow. It's just a consideration, right? So when you're thinking about the design here, these are things to think about. But in spite of all that, I still say that client script in the CRM is one of Zoho CRM's, I'll say, best features. I think that with the use of client script, you can do things that even a few years ago, I know we were all wishing were possible. And some of those things aren't always as self-evident. And it's something I want us to think about too, is how can we think about incorporating client script into projects? It's the kind of thing that I think lends itself well to suggestion sometimes. It's something that maybe if you're working for a customer, they might not really be thinking about all of these use cases. Some they will, but it's definitely worth time to just dive into certain aspects of it to start to acclimate in terms of what it really can do. All right. So we're going to focus in 3 areas today. We're going to talk about maintainability, we're going to talk about the ZDK, and we're going to talk about widgets. And as we go through this, I've just got a little bit of sample code. It's nothing like really intense. Of course, you can do really intense things with client script. I'm not going to do that live with you today. But each of these areas, I'm going to give you some tips and then show you a little bit based on my experience. All right, tips for code maintainability. First of all, embrace the JavaScript paradigms and develop your own style. JavaScript things to consider are use of objects, understanding global and local scopes, using functions. Another really key one that I'll show you is how JavaScript deals with equivalence if you're not familiar. It's a little different than something like Deluge, and it's just good to be up on that. I'll show you all this in a moment here. Also, the use of versions. You can see versions of your code in the editor and client script. Really powerful, great to use. I'll show you that. Another concept, which really comes from the website and web app world, I would say, is to reinforce any kind of front-end automation that would perpetuate to the save with back-end automation. I'll show you how and why on that. And then my biggest maintainability tip, honestly, if you walk away with one thing today, one thing only, is to use static resources. And so let me pull up a sample environment here. And let's go through a couple of these examples. All right, so this is a custom module. Pretty trivial custom module. And all custom modules, as you know, require a name. And sometimes that name is kind of meaningless, right? Like if you're storing data about a particular thing, like in this case, you can see I have an account lookup and a contact lookup. Probably that's the meaningful data. There's probably nothing in a name that is really valuable, but you need that name. So a lot of us will concatenate things, and we do that a lot of times with backend automation. Maybe set an account, maybe set a contact. I don't know, maybe throw a period in here or something. Save it. We refresh. I'm sure this is familiar to a lot of you. And that name will come through. because I have workflow and Deluge function already set up. You can see it was called here. You can see the record got named. Well, this is annoying for the user. And that's a good place to start in terms of our jumping into client script. I know it's a very basic example for some of you, but let's just dive in right there. So I want to name that record before it gets saved so that I don't have to throw some temporary value in there. And so if we open up client script, add a new script, and you could consider the triggers any number of different ways here. I'm going to pick my Zoho. Oh, sorry. I'm going to do this on the create page. Here's a really key thing if you haven't acclimated to this yet in client script. The page, they're all managed separately, and within that, the layouts are managed separately too. So you could potentially have, this is one of the big maintainability challenges, you could potentially have a need for, if I need to do this on create, on edit, and on clone, and I have multiple layouts, I mean, that could be like 6 different scripts. But let's do it so it updates as the selections are made. You don't necessarily have to do it that way, but I'm going to do it that way. So let's say when account is edited on the create page, all right, and so the code here is pretty simple. I'm just gonna paste some of this in and talk about it just in the interest of time. All right, first I'm getting the account field is what's happening there. That's the field itself, the object. And from that field, I'm getting its value. Likewise with contact. These are the API names of those fields. And then I'll show you, we can log, if you want to see what it looks like, we can log, you have to stringify it, which if you're not familiar with this is something that familiarize yourself with, that just converts the object to a string. Go into this test window here. Client script runs in the browser. So a lot of times we need to do a reload when we come in here because client script runs in the browser. So every time you're loading this, your browser is downloading the most recent version and it's caching it for some time, right? So when you make changes with client script, you don't always see those changes right away unless you do a reload. All right, so the trigger was on the change of account. And you can see what I get here is an object. This is a stringified object, the ID of that account and the name of it. So this is how we can get our name pretty easily, right? So just bring in a little bit more code here. And here's where I'm saying embrace the JavaScript and the things that it can do. This is the ternary operator, if you're not familiar. So I'm saying if the account object is null, then just give me an empty string. Otherwise, give me the name, which is the that's the key there. Again, this is where you'll develop your own style of JavaScript, and it may be similar to mine. It may be somewhat different from mine. I tend to use the let prefix. A lot of the Zoho documentation says to use var. Var is fine. It doesn't really matter for our purposes here. Const, I don't know if it's just me, but I get weird results when I use const in client script. So I pretty much avoid it. But yeah, let works pretty well. And then finally, let's just make this update. Okay, so we're getting the name field and we're setting its value, and I just kind of lazily concatenated inside of the parentheses there. You could do it separately and then pass in another value, that'd be fine. Sure, I can make the screen bigger, no problem. All right, so now the change was on account. So if I change account, you'll see I've got half of my name here. If I change contact, nothing is going to happen yet because I'm on account. But if I change account again, then you can see that this is forming prior to save. right? What's nice about this is you can actually even tuck that name field down at the bottom of the record if it's not meaningful. And so just keep it out of the way that the user doesn't have to worry about it. So that's a really simple approach, but here's a big problem. We talk about maintainability. So if I have multiple layouts and I need to consider the create, the edit, the clone, I could copy paste this, but then like, let's say we want to change it down the road. You got a nightmare on your hands as far as changing that. So this is where use of static resources is really valuable. Let me just show you how you can do that. The first thing we need to do is we need to put this into a function, which we'll define. We'll say function. I'm just going to call it Zug naming. And actually, in this case, because I'm not using the value as input, we'll talk about that later. I could use it here, but it makes it less reusable. Just bring this in. Okay, so now this is this is a unit of code, and all I need to do is just call it like that. That'll work. Now, this is where you can convert this to a static resource. I'm just going to open up Notepad right now. You could use VS Code or a text editor of your choice. Doesn't matter. But I'm just going to cut this, paste it into Notepad, save it. We'll call it Zug script.js. .js is important. All right, and then I go to client script, static resources. I already had an example up here. Let me open it. Let's see. Let me open a new one here. Okay, so now you have this static resource, and if you ever need to access this in terms of reading it, you can go view file, and it's pretty low tech. It just opens like right in your browser like this. But if you ever need to make updates to this, then you can, if you don't have it anymore, you can copy this into a file, update it. But now, if I go to static resources and reload, you'll see Zug's script is here. I'm going to add it. And now this will work because Zug naming is in the global scope. Now all I need to do, if I'm going to have six different functions to set a name, all I need to do is have this one line. And if I need to make an update to this, I just update the static resource. Like I said, if you take one thing away from this today, and static resources can be far more complex, right? And you can have many functions in the same static resource. But yeah, it makes a big difference in terms of maintainability. Like I said, I'm looking forward to hearing your maintainability ideas too at the end, if you've got other ones. So if I wanted the same thing to happen on on a contact change, I'm just setting this up really quick. All I need to do is make sure the static resource is included, which it is. Good. And you can see actually the autocomplete even shows it. Save that. So now when I go to this module, apparently my refresh didn't take. This is, if you haven't worked in client script, this is just get used to refreshing your browser because it's gonna have to happen. I must not have saved. Oh wait, there it goes. Sorry, there it goes. All right, something is just running slow. And so that'll happen on save. Now you could do that simply just on save the record. There's an on save trigger too, and then it wouldn't have to update in real time. I just did that to illustrate this point, of course. But yeah. Let's see. Back to the client script editor, just a couple more things to show you while we're here. I used that log, like that, to log to the test environment. You can also use console.log if you want to log to the browser console. And you could use either. It just depends on, if you're testing in here, definitely log is the way to go. If you're wanting to test more just in the browser outside of here, then console.log is what you want to use. There's also this versions, as I mentioned, you can use the revisions, and if I had made multiple saves, there would be multiple choices. It shows the difference, and I can, if you mess something up, you can go back, which is always great, right? It would be wonderful if we had that for Deluge in the CRM, but it is here, and definitely make use of it. All right. Back to the slides for just a moment here. Oh yeah, the one other thing I want to talk about, to reinforce front-end automation with back-end automation. This is a common practice. You don't need to do it in every case, but if you're saving something, you typically want to have Deluge standing behind. You want to have Deluge standing behind the client script. And the reason why is, first and foremost, user entry, as you all know, is not the only way to create records in CRM, right? And so if someone is doing an import, or if they're creating records via the API, I mean, there are still maybe some exceptions to be considered there, but you want to have backend automation. It will do nothing if it's, if the name is already set. But if for some reason the name is not able to set, or even if somehow the user figures out how to intervene and prevent this JavaScript from running, you know that on the back end, you'll still have good integrity of data. So just keep that in mind. It's a simple thing to do, but it's a good, I'd say, best practice. If you're simply modifying the UI, if it doesn't have anything to do with data saving, then you don't necessarily need to do that, obviously. But it's, it's good to have, if you're going to have validation, it's good to have it on both sides. All right. Back to the slides here. Yeah, I really love Ula, by the way. Thanks for that comment. I'm a big fan. I've pretty much completely migrated over to it. Yep. All right. The Zoho Development Kit. Now, this is the way, I've already used a little bit of it. This is the way that we interact with the CRM. And so the first thing I would point you to, I'm just going to bring this over, is the documentation itself. This has pretty much everything you can do in client script, and especially the objects are really important to understand. So like ZDK page, you saw me getting fields, setting fields, subforms, components, things like that. Client helps you present messages. We'll do some examples of that later. HTTP allows for request response over HTTP. And then UI's got some more UI modifications. The other ones, though, that I think are really great are these utility objects, especially the one we end up using a lot is client. Because with client, you can figure out who the person is. I believe it's client. Well, you can get their URL. Maybe I'm misspeaking. Maybe it's not client. I'm sorry. I thought it was client. Is it? Oh, it's CRM. I apologize. Yeah, so you can find out who the person is, which means then you can fire a subsequent request to get their profile or their role. You can make decisions about the UI based on who they are, which is really nice. I mean, you can modify a list view according to who they are and what list they're on. I mean, you think of the possibilities, because there's a ton you can do with this contextual information. And then you've got a lot of documentation that we're not going to run through together right now, but I really recommend, if you haven't looked at this, and I'll put the link in the chat here right now. If you haven't looked at this, just read through it. I mean, you'll see all sorts of things that you can do that maybe you had no idea that you could do with the user interface. I think as a community, we've really only scratched the surface of the ways that the CRM UI can be modified using these tools. So that's the first thing I'll point you to, is go read that documentation. I'm going to show you some examples of some things, but obviously there's no way that I can cover all the different things, or that I've thought even remotely. Like I'm always thinking about, like, I'm sure that there's way more I could do with this than what we're doing today. All right, so I want to give you some tips, and in this section in particular, I want to show you some things that I sort of consider to be quirks. It doesn't mean that client script isn't incredibly powerful, but just know what you're getting into sometimes. All right, so we already talked a little bit about the CRM objects, the utilities objects. We didn't talk yet about the input parameters, and we'll talk about that a little bit in an example. Something to know is, the Zoho team is incredible at rolling out new functionality, and I mean, I know we've experienced that sometimes the documentation it lags a little behind. Totally normal. I mean, it'd be great if that wasn't the case, but that's what it's like sometimes being on the very edge of these features. And so I've had great experiences just reaching out to contacts at Zoho, whether it be with support or whomever, just for help. If I'm trying to implement something new and it's just not there how to do it, there are great people that can help you figure it out. So don't be afraid to ask, of course, in the right way to the right person at the right time. But definitely, or this community for that matter, of course. I feel like lookups are really weird to set, so I'm going to make sure I show you that. And then I wanted to show you a little bit about functions and connections, another little quirk that I've run into, as well as a couple of other examples. So let's dive back into the code. Now, from this point forward, pretty much I'm not going to worry about maintainability. I'm just gonna code it more or less procedurally in here. But understand that any of these could be wrapped into a function, put into a static resource, called from multiple places. That would be really the ideal way to work a lot of this. All right, let's talk about a couple of common use cases here for client script. So right now I have this custom module, and I have an account and I have a contact, and they are they should be related. The contact should be a contact for this account, but there's nothing enforcing that. There's nothing. So a couple things we could do when we change the account, we could want this to only show contacts that are related. We could also say that when we change the contact, we want their account, if they have one, to be here, right? I mean, those are sort of two actually pretty simple things to do with client script. And so now you've probably all seen lookup filters that you can set from the module, but those are the module setup, but those are static, right? Those are static. So you have to set it to a static value. It can't dynamically update. But the code for this, if you haven't done it, is actually really simple. I've got just 3 lines here. And again, choose your own adventure in terms of paradigm. But value is the input parameter in client script, and what value is usually the most updated version of that field in the UI, not saved on the back end, but that field in the UI. And Eric contributed something, which I'm going to share here in a minute, about understanding some of these differences between what you're actually grabbing. I thought that was really insightful, and I'm going to put it up on the screen here in a moment. But so if the field is empty, this is going to come in null. And JavaScript, because it has this concept of truthy and falsy values, I can just use the not operator ahead of value and just say, hey, if it's empty, we're done, right? It's over. And so then this will never run. Now you could branch it. You could approach this however you want to approach it. This is just my way of approaching it. All right. So I'm going to get that contact field. I'm going to get the field, not its value. Remember, this is the field object. And then I'm going to use this set criteria method. And this is the same as like the search records syntax in Deluge or in the JavaScript SDK for widgets. It's just, the separated by parentheses. And I'm just grabbing the ID from that value. And so let's look at an example here. See if I can do it without refreshing. because I know the refresh takes time. So I'm going to pick an account. Go to contact. I did an update. Yep. Let me refresh. I had hopes. All right. Pick an account. Sorry, everyone. Not sure why. Sometimes too, I've encountered this where this testing environment, even with refreshing, doesn't update. And if that happens, saving it and going into the main UI typically works. Yeah, I'm going to do that. You shouldn't need to save there to go to the test. In fact, that's kind of the advantage of that, is because you can make a change, because once you save it, it's live, so you got to be careful about that. But in this case, obviously, it's fine. All right. So select an account. So this, yeah. Let me just look at my code. It should work fine. I mean, this is, all of you have experienced something like this, no doubt. Okay. Contact field, set criteria, account name equals value. That should be fine. I won't waste your time on this too much if it doesn't end up working. But this is really it. I'm sure I'm just having a browser issue. Yeah, it should be on the create page, definitely, which I think is where I am. One more shot and then we'll move on. But you get the idea here. It may be that if I'm selecting, maybe I didn't account just very simply for, yeah. All right, so what should happen here is when the account is selected, only you'll have a short list for the contacts. It won't be all of them. And I'm not sure, yeah, why in this moment that's not happening, but I'm not going to take up a ton of your time with it. This is the idea, and this should work. You can also add a second parameter here as to whether it should work on search or not, and you can find that in the documentation. Yeah, it is a really fantastic use case, Eric. And I'm sorry it's not for some reason. I mean, I tested this an hour before this presentation, and of course it worked fine. Yeah, so account name, Mike, is the API name on the contact. Value.id. Oh, is that it? No, that's value.id. That's the account, right? That's the account. Yeah. Anyway, we're gonna move on. I'll post a revision later or something. But let's talk about the other use case. We can go to our contact change here. And this was to set the account. Oh, that's why. It's in the wrong function. See, this is the issue, right? As we were discussing. They look the same. I named them the same thing, which in retrospect was maybe not smart. You probably wouldn't do that in a real implementation. But here we are. It's a real moment for everyone. All right, and now just two contacts. That's the idea. There we go. Feels good to get one right. And so that's and you can do that in any kind of complex way that you want to. I did a pretty simple way. But if you had multiple parameters you wanted to consider, something like that, or if you wanted to filter based on like you have a state field and you only want people to show up according to a state, something like that, like all that is possible, right? And then really the sky's the limit with your JavaScript there. The other one to set the account based on the contact. Bring this in. All right. Yeah, great. Couple steps here, and this involves, so again, if it's empty, we're just going to stop. Get the full contact record. You can use apps.crm. The module name, fetch the ID, and then I've got that ID there. The account ID will be present in that contact at account name lookup ID. Let me actually just show you what this much of it looks like, because I know I found this confusing when I started doing this. And maybe if there are any like hardcore JavaScript folks out there, maybe you'd tell me that it's totally normal and I'm off base. But this was a little strange to me at first, so I want to show it to you because it might be strange to you too. All right, so if I select an account, and actually I'm going to use this view so I can make sure I pick one that does have an account. Pick one that does. Oh, yeah, I got to stringify it. Oh, sorry. I need to do that object. Okay, so you get the full, here's the full data map of the record, right? And you can see you get this account name lookup ID, so you can see it there. It's got a little underscore on the front of it, I think to denote, in a lot of languages that would denote a private field, but that's not really how this works. And when you access it, you do not include that initial underscore. And that was the thing I found confusing, because I'm like, well, I don't really know what the keys are, but let me just go look at the data. And just know that like they all have this underscore on it, but you don't use that. You don't use that initial underscore. And so that's how you can tell. That's how you can tell that, okay, I've got my account ID at this spot here. Again, if that's empty, we're just going to stop. Otherwise, let's get the full record to get the name, because the name of the account is not present in that data. Here's the thing that I was saying about setting a lookup. And I don't think this is incredibly well documented in the world. So to set a lookup, it's not like Deluge where you can just pass the ID. You need to form an object in JavaScript, which is kind of like a map in Deluge if you're not super familiar with JavaScript. It's key values. And you need the ID and you need the name, lowercase, for all modules, not just custom. And you need that name. And so like when you get a lookup in Deluge, you get a structure from the API that looks kind of like this, right? But you can set it with just an ID in Deluge. JavaScript, not so much. You need this full object structure. This is really key, and I think it's out there like in the forums, but I don't know. I'm not aware of it even being documented anywhere else. That's a great question, Mike, and I actually don't know. I've never tried to do it the wrong way and see. Yeah, let's try it. Okay, yeah, let's do that. Let's see. See what happens. All right. Yeah, because if it doesn't matter, then you could just pass any old string, right? And then you wouldn't have to look up the account. Oh, so it throws that in there. I wonder what happens on save. This is fun. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So actually, you can throw. I mean, you could really actually simplify this, and you get rid of that, and you could put anything. You need this key, but you could put anything in there, I guess, until Zoho sees this and fixes it. But until that moment, yeah. Right. Yeah, that's a good point, Mike. Thanks. Okay. One other thing is just some basic validation that can be done here. You see, I have. Let's go to an on save one. On save is nice. We'll do. We'll do a create page. And so on save happens just it's when you hit the save button. All of the standard stuff runs, like mandatory fields, things like that, and then this will run. All right. So I've got in the UI. I've got an expiration date field, which is a date, and I want this to only save if the date is in the future. And so, yeah, I'm just going to bring this in. I use a little function here. So I just defined a little function. Again, this could be in static resource, could be reusable. It's simply just parsing the whatever date is passed into it. JavaScript is really nice and flexible with date parsing. You can pass in a lot of different formats and it will understand it pretty intuitively. And then you get the current date just by calling or by instantiating in your date object and then just doing a comparison. That's all you got to do. So this is going to return true if it is if it's in the future. Right? That's what this will do. So we get our expiration date field. This doesn't handle if it's empty, which you'd want to do obviously. You get the value of that field. If it's it does handle it. I'm sorry. If it's empty, return false. Return false is what prevents the save. And then also if it's not in the future, then we're going to do this show error and we're going to return false. I recommend you do it this way. You could do, just very functionally, you could just say return is date in future expiration, right? You could do that and it would return true or false and save or not save, but you're not giving any kind of UI indication of what's going on there. So it's good to do something like show error, which you're going to see what that looks like. So I need to set my fields or it's going to be upset with me for that. Okay, so if I set an expiration date in the past and save, you can see the save gets rejected. Date must be in future. And again, you could do very complex validation here, right? Like this was just a really simple one, but you could, you can do that kind of validation prior to save. You could do this to stand in front of data validation rules, traditional data validation rules, or you could, do it more custom. If we save it, yeah, we've got the US format here. All right. So that's, simple validation. You can also display yeah, I know. Date formats are a touchy topic. You can also display sort of more modal type messages, like a pop-up you might think of, right? Rather than the data validation kind of message, you could do that too, like a big, all sorts of them. Let's go look at the documentation, look on the web, because there are all sorts of different ways of displaying this kind of stuff. All right, one more ZDK thing I want to show you. This one I'm just gonna show you in here. Actually, yeah, let me set a return false just to prevent the save. All right, so you can call functions. You can call Deluge functions, which is really useful if you want to trigger something that you already have Deluge for, right? That's one good reason to do it. Sometimes an even better reason is that the Deluge just has, in general, better integration methods with the CRM. You can write the API calls here. You can. Like I'm thinking things like COCOL and bulk updates and things like that, right? Like you could write the API calls here, but a lot of times it's just better to have a Deluge script for it and then to call the Deluge script here. And so it's pretty easy to kick off a function. I have two examples here. One doesn't require any parameters. That's the first one. And so I'm just going to bring that in and show you what it looks like. All right, so it's at functions.execute. This is the name of the function. I'm just passing an empty object in for parameters since there are none, and I'm logging the response. And so what's important before you do this is you have to, in the function, you have to turn on OAuth for that function. This won't work if you don't turn on OAuth. You don't need an API key, but you need to turn on OAuth on the function for this to work. All right, so if I just do this on save, I should prevent the save, and you should see how it looks. This is the data coming back from my function. The output is my return, hello from CS example 1. Pretty straightforward, right? And so there could be a lot of logic that could happen there to kick it off. Where I've had issues are with inputs. If I just have a string input, it works without issue. But if I've got, very often I'm passing in like an API style object or a map or whatever with keys and values, and I run into parsing issues. I have not been able to get that to work right. And the last time I talked to support about it, they said, well, use a connection for that use case. And so I said, okay, and I haven't looked back. I've been doing that. So let me bring in another one that uses a connection and show you what that looks like. All right, so this also invokes a function, but it's using a CRM connection. And so I've got this params object that has, this is the variable name, the input name in the Deluge function, and then I've stringified a map that I want to use. And then connections.invoke CRM functions, that's the name of my connection string. And then here is the full URL of the function, which you can get that from when you go to turn on OAuth, you can copy it there. Yeah, and I agree, Mike. And I have, like I said, when you just pass in a string only, it seems to work. But I think there's something going on with the parsing of JSON that is causing it to be invalid. And hopefully it gets fixed. See, it's a GET request, but you could do a POST too if you were so inclined, or a PUT or whatever. And so then when I run this one, did I not stringify the, did I not? Oh, who knows? If you ever get confused about what's going on here, you can always clear. Good idea sometimes. Save the record. Oh, I think I hit this save. I think that was what it was. Yeah, so connection successfully invoked, and you can see here's the data coming back from the function. So that's the workaround, I'd say. Works pretty well. It is, yeah, the other method, like Mike said, is much cleaner. Hopefully this gets resolved. And if you're just passing in a string value or something like that, you might still be good with this one. But I ran into problems, so I've been doing it this way. All right. More little UI thing I want to show you before we talk about our final topic. And there are so many of these. Like, there are so many of these. I wish that we could just go through like and document and make good videos on all of them, because there are, I'm sure, a ton that I'm not even considering. Like, especially we're not talking about the list view, we're not talking about Canvas, where there's an inordinate amount of things you can do, like changing label text and things like that. But I have here this city state field, which you would never do. You would never do this. It would be really weird, but I'm doing it for an example. And I want actually to present a kind of an intermediate form for the user to fill that out. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to add a new script. Let's call it city state. And then we'll do a page event. We'll do a field event. And we'll do it on type, which means the first character entered triggers it. Ideally, someday we'll have a trigger for like when they enter the field, when the field is in focus. That would be lovely if anyone's listening who can make that happen. but this is pretty good for now. All All right, so you can actually pop, this is a pretty new feature, last couple months maybe, you can actually pop a little CRM style input off of this. It's really nice. The syntax is not too bad. I'm going to say, let's say let val, I'm going to use val equals, and it's zdk.client.get input. That's the one you want. It takes an array of your inputs. Each one of those gets a type, which is going to be like text or number. And let's say it gets a label, which this first one is going to be city. Oh, city. You have to sort of ignore the code completion that's going on here. Then it gets another one, state. And that's going to return an array with like the first value at index 0, the second value at index 1, and so on. And so then we can just update zdk.page.get field. The API name of that field is city state. And then we'll set the value, and I'm just going to lazily concatenate this right here. You could take a different approach, and we'll say val sub 0, the first, that's the city, plus comma space, plus val sub 1, that's the state. Yeah, let me show you what this looks like, because it's actually pretty cool. I have not used this a lot yet, but I'm trying to think of ways to. The triggering is kind of the catch, because the triggering can feel a little awkward. But like if I type a first character, to refresh. Okay, let's go to the real thing. Let me just make sure. Create page, field event on type. No, that's good. I'll save it. Fresh here. This is a pretty normal client script experience. Again, it's not without its quirks, but the value you can derive from it is really tremendous. All right. So I type, give it a second. Let me come back over here. I wanted to, oh, I forgot some parameters. That's why, that's on me. You need a label, like a heading. And then you need like what the affirmative button is and what the negative button is, like to accept and not accept. That's on me. I missed that in my notes. Sorry about that. Like I said, this one's kind of new for me. Let me just do this. I'm sure I'm just missing something. Oh, I think I was missing maybe that. Refresh this one too. Sorry, folks. Once again, I'm sure it's something small. I got my trigger right. Let's see if it loads in the real record here. Give it a second. There it goes. Okay, this is probably going to run a bunch of times. Yeah, it's probably going to run a bunch of times because I think the on type is the issue here. So you can see that this is the UI presented this, right? And this is not a widget. I didn't have to make a widget. This is just this. And so I could say city, state, and it's going to ask me for this like a bunch more times because it's doing it for each character. The trigger is kind of a challenge. Okay, so there you go. You could do it on like an on change, but that would also be awkward. So I think the feature is really powerful. And if anyone, when we get to questions, if anyone's got a good way to implement it, I'd love to know more. But I really like to be able to sort of bring up a UI that looks like CRM, and we don't have to deal with widgets for that. Yeah, that makes sense, Kamal. Thank you. Yeah, good point. I know I'm screen sharing too, which tends to slow things down. The browser execution definitely. Okay. So I mean, that's, I know, just a scratch at the surface. There's so much more, but hopefully that gives you some helpful tips. I wanted to thank Eric for sharing this. This is in our Click channel too, and he was talking about how page.record with the $sign pulls up the backend data, whereas zdk.page.getField gets the value of the field on the client side. And then also I mentioned that value is always the most current UI data too. If you're changing that field, you'll have a value parameter which will have that field's data. And so this was really great, Eric. Thank you for sharing this. Appreciate it. All right, we don't have a ton of time left, so I'll move through this relatively quickly. There are just a few things I really want to hit. This was something that rolled out in the past year, that we can now invoke widgets from client script, and it's amazing. Like, if you haven't done anything with this yet, have a look, because it's pretty great. All right, so know the widget options you have, understand how to launch it, and understand how to send and return data using the correct widget SDK. So you have 3 options, and you can find documentation on all of these. Sorry, I lost my notes here. You have flyouts, pop-ups, and callouts. Let me show you what the callout is like. This is a really simple. This is a really simple one that is not. It doesn't do a lot. But sorry, hold on. It's on the create page. So the flyout is to help you set a field, and the use case that Zoho shared was if you have like an external lookup. So that was what I was simulating here. It's like with a work drive invoice, you're going to have that on type trigger. This is a widget. This is not Zoho UI. This is a very simple and static widget. But you can see how this comes up and then fills in. So you could have some call to some other service, grab that data, throw it in here. That's a call out. I'm going to show you more in depth a pop-up, and then we'll talk about flyouts too. Because flyouts and pop-ups are pretty similar. They just work a little differently. All right. Oh, I need to go to the edit. Yeah, this is right. Good. This is right. All right. So I added a widget to the page here on this description multi-line, and it triggers on save. So I can start to type a description here. And when I go to save, this is the pop-up. Oh, I have the widget installed, but not the script. I'm sorry. Let me do that. Show you the script. All right. Forgot that I took that off. All right, so this is going to be on the list page standard, and it's going to be oh, I'm sorry. Not the list page, detail page standard. Field event, it was that details field. On before update is the only trigger you have in this context. So it's just right before save. All right, bring in my widget code here. All right, so I made this a little bit abstract if I wanted to change it, but the field name is description. That's the API name of the field. I have a variable I'm calling initial text. That's the value being passed in. And then you have the zdk.client.openPup. You have the API name, which you can now get very easily if you go to edit your widgets. The API name is now listed. It didn't used to be. And in fact, when this first rolled out, you had to inspect the HTML and get the ID of the widget to make this work. It's working much better now. Type is widget. Here's a header, and you can look up all these different parameters in the documentation. But you've got size options, you've got position options. Text, initial text. This is something I'm passing into the widget. My widget expects this, so it could be anything, but I'm passing these parameters in to the widget so that it takes it and it sets a certain state to start. Save that. Refresh this. The widget is already loaded, I promise. Saved. So you see I already have a value here. I'm just going to add a period to it. Refresh again. Did I set it for record name? I did. Sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Thank you all for bearing with me. I know I'm going kind of quick on some of this and I'm making a few mistakes. Okay, detailed page. Field event. Field is detail or description. So I meant to set for update. Paste, save, refresh. It's going to be worth it, I promise. Okay. So this is the widget I made. And you can you could paste into this. You could have this nice line here. It shows you how many characters you've got left. Update, comes back in here and saves. And then the next time I go to update it, like if I delete some stuff here, again, ideally we'd have like an on focus or something like that, right? But we don't. But this is, I don't know why it's not loading now. Anyway, you saw it once. That's how it works. And so the key thing here on this side of it is you need to pass some initial values to your widget, and this is configured by you, right, or whoever develops your widget. The widget is expecting certain input, and you provide it here, and then the widget will return data, and you can use that data to update the UI. In the widget itself, two things are important. One, in your HTML, you need to make sure you're using at least 1.2. 1.2, if I pull up the API documentation here, or the SDK documentation, which now if I go to latest, this is good. This is at least 1.2. But you're making use of this client, which is not in previous versions of the JavaScript SDK. So that's really important that you make sure you're using the most recent version. And then the other thing, so I go to the app.js, you can see I've used it. Oh, thanks for posting that. You can see I've used that here. And so it's this $client.close, and then I'm just sending an object back. This could have many parameters. It's just in my case, I only have the one. And I had made this in a way to be configurable both off of buttons. That's the other important part, and I should have said that first. When you load the widget in, I didn't show you that. You should load it in as a button widget. There's not a widget type for ClientScript. Button widget is the right type. So load that in. and it'll work just kind of like it's off of a button, but where we usually close a widget like this with close or close reload, with the client script version, you want to close it like this, and that'll pass the value back. Flyouts, I'm not going to show you. Flyouts are a lot like the pop-up, except they don't take over the context. So a flyout can sit like on the right-hand side, or it can sit, somewhere, and you can still continue to use the UI and have the flyout widget visible, and you can interact with it at any point while it's live. So that's really the main difference between a flyout and a pop-up. They're both super awesome, and I can't wait to implement them more. Yeah. All right. Let me just go back to my slides one last time. Yeah. So we've got a little bit of time left here, right? I'd love just any, of course, questions, but also if there are things that you really like to do in client script that I didn't talk about. I know there are lots that I didn't talk about. I don't do a ton personally with keeping track of errors, because usually, in most cases, the errors are going to be backed up by backend, and there's not like a great way of logging, right? But I also haven't implemented a lot of client script that I would say is mission critical client script, right? Like usually the system's going to be fine if something doesn't quite work right. We test to get rid of everything that would be obvious. But yeah, that would be an interesting topic too. And if anyone else certainly knows. Yeah, and then the final one, yeah, that's smart, Mike. That makes sense too. Just send it to a click channel. Yeah, totally. When you're coding, different commands show up in the autocomplete, such as edk.app. So there's documentation that I shared. There are a couple other pages. This is something I think I briefly alluded to it in the slides, but didn't really explain it. Client script has evolved a lot since it's been out, and I think there are commands and syntaxes that just are no longer. They're just no. So I don't know if the autocomplete is completely current, and that would be, if it's not documented. I mean, you can always explore it. Sometimes there are undocumented things you can find, but yeah, I'm not sure. Those are good questions, Eric. Think about those. So you can basically, like, under certain conditions, not allow any further changes in the UI while that is set. And so, like, let's say you had some field being set and then you wanted something to run and you didn't want any changes in the UI until that was complete. You could set UI freeze to true, have that work, and then set UI freeze to false. But I don't like to use UI freeze, because we've had it happen where if something hangs and then that record, like, is kind of toast until someone refreshes their browser. It's been a while since I've used it, so maybe it's performing better, but I had really inconsistent experiences with it when I started using it, and so I tend to avoid it. Yeah, exactly. You can make a field read only, you could hide a field, something like that. Yeah.
All right. So thanks again. All of you have a wonderful day and wonderful weekends. See you in the next session.